Please welcome director Tobias Lindholm and actor Eddie Redmayne. Right. Yeah, thank you. Welcome, Tobias, and welcome back, Eddie.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Excellent. Tobias, I've seen the film a couple of times, and I was struck by the fact that it's almost like two movies. The first half, where Amy doesn't know about Charlie, and then the second half when she does know. And I loved your visual landscape, where as the movie progresses, we start seeing close-ups. Once Amy starts, knows who he is. Can you tell us about your approach of the two parts of the film?
So, and I very well spotted. My only wish when we started to talk about this project like 6-7 years ago was to shoot it in sequence. So I would basically shoot it from day one and just follow it all the way through. The pandemic made that impossible because we had to shoot out certain locations. So the only way we could stay kind of true to the idea was to make a midpoint. So we finished all the shootings when she didn't know, and then we started to when she knew, which also gave the DP, Jodie Lee Lipes, a wonderful filmmaker, and me the opportunity to make a very precise choice. From today, we will step 1 foot closer, not just change the optic, and not just change the camera work, but actually physically move the camera closer to Amy and to Charles as we portray them. And the whole idea was clearly that now there's much more on stake. In the first one, let's just stay out here and watch these people as this unfolds. Let's not be wiser than Amy. Let's not know more than she does. As soon as we do, as soon as we know what's on stake, as soon as we know the consequences of his doing, we can move in. Mm-hmm. So we very, very precisely did that.
Right. Eddie, as people have pointed out, you've been here before. The last time you were here, you talked about working with Alexandra Reynolds, a ballet dancer that helps you with physicality. And watching the film, there is this incredible physicality to Charlie. Can you tell us about? I'm assuming you work with Alexandra again.
We did, actually, yeah.
And then you're taken to the character vis-a-vis the physicality.
So the film is, there's a brilliant book called The Good Nurse, which our film is like the last third of. And the other 2/3 are really intricate biography of Charlie's life. And so it was a kind of actor's dream to have this Bible of information. But having played a few real people, the thing I've become more inspired by is how other artists interpret those people. And this man called Charles Graeber wrote the book, and it's a non-fiction book, but he's also a poetic writer. And he described, having spent quite a lot of time with Charlie in jail, how Charlie looked like a question mark. And that was such a sort of a way in for me. It was both a physical iteration. He had this extraordinary posture, but it was also about blankness. It was about anonymity. Anyway, I took this, I did a day's working with Alex Reynolds, who is this wonderful dancer who I first worked with on The Theory of Everything. And we spent this day sort of looking at all the footage of Charlie. And she observed that it was almost, he had a very traumatic childhood. He was abused when he was 7, first tried to kill someone age 7 and tried to kill himself age 7. And she saw she was like that, it's almost as if all that trauma is held here in the nape of his neck, and as if he's being held up by his collar almost. And it was so interesting because that sort of gave you that question mark a posture, but it was also hidden. He could look up at everything whilst trying to be invisible. So I did a day with Alex, and then Tobias and I arrived in New York, because Tobias amazingly fought for a month's rehearsal for Jess and I, and we went to nurse school and various things. But like that was something that we worked on together, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. But what was it like for you to be seeing the world from that vantage point? The fact that your body's being pulled from behind, and did it help?
It really helped. It was interesting because instantly it makes him, I don't know if the right word is recessive, but almost vulnerable. And one of Charlie's keys into people was his own vulnerability. Like Amy and we were lucky enough to spend time with the real Amy making this movie, and she described how this was two different human beings. She met this man who she adored, who saved her life, who was kind, was empathetic, and then twice she met this monster who was a different human being. But what she said was the way that he befriended her, and if you read his biography, this is how he did it with many of the other hospitals beforehand, was this self-deprecating, like he would often talk about what a fuck up his life was and, you know, his home life, but he would laugh about it. There was a kind of, the joke was always on him, and it was a way of actually making people want to look after him and also express their vulnerability to him. So that idea of physically how that manifested was important, to be non-threatening so that people kind of want to care for you.
Yeah. And just to add to that, because I remember Eddie bringing this up. I was lucky enough that Eddie spent time in his trailer doing Fantastic Beasts on preparing for this. So we had several phone conversations in the month leading into us meeting in New York. And Eddie kept talking about this question mark. And I have to be honest, like I was like, yeah, that's some actor's thing. It'll work for him. It'll be fine, whatever he needs in his process to get there. And then when we got on the first day of shooting, we had different like openings of the film ready. We had shots of down a hallway at a hospital, and then we would end up in the shot that now opens the film. And as we set up that shot, I was looking in through the door frame, and Eddie was in there posturing this question mark all of a sudden. And I was mesmerized. I was like, oh my God, that's what he meant. It's like, you know, putting on a mask. And that's what my job now will be for the next 10 weeks. We'll try to demask this question mark that he's posing. And that created the whole opening of the film. So we basically deleted all the rest of the ideas for openings and just extended the zoom. We had the idea that the zoom should take around 1 minute, and we just made it like 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're just like, let's go as slow as possible in on this guy as he finds his question mark, squeezes himself into the corner and stands there. And it reminded me of the opening of The Verdict, where Paul Newman is playing the ping ball, and you slowly get in and start to realize that you have to focus on this guy. And Eddie's question mark, you know, offered that opportunity right away.
You also, Tobias, we're used to seeing serial killer movies where the focus is on the serial killer. You switch things around where we're focusing on Amy and her heroic work that she does. Can you tell us about changing the trope of how we see a film like this?
I think that, you know, as storytellers, we and filmmakers, we have a responsibility to not just reproduce films that we have seen before. And as you say, we have seen serial killer movies, and we have been obsessed with their darkness, and we have seen serial killers sitting in basements and you know, torturing flies and realizing their evil darkness in that. And I felt that to be extremely boring. But suddenly I realized that we could do a serial killer movie about my mom, about a lonely, struggling woman who brought up these children and ended up doing what a whole society couldn't do, what a whole system couldn't do, stop the most prolific serial killer in American history. And it made so much sense to change perspective and just be on Amy and not know more than her. And also because what she did was so extraordinary. I think it's such a beautiful thought that it's almost unrealistic that a woman reminds a serial killer of his own humanity and gets him to confess. That idea is so crazy that then when I realized that was what the whole film should be about, it all made sense.
And Eddie, from your vantage point, the character is such a nice guy, but the nicer he is, the scarier he is. And you know, can you tell us about that duality? And was it a challenge for you to play the two sides? I'm just curious how you were able to synthesize the duality of him.
Well, Sorry, just while you were answering that question, I was just reminded what a beautiful cinema this is. It's like one of the most breathtaking cinemas I've ever been to. It's it really is.
Somebody recording that so we can
There's the duality was something that I was wrestling with, like the notion of the why. You know, this, when I read this script, I was like, well, why? You know, why did he do this? And doing all the research, there was never a why. And the key for me was understanding that and going like, we as audiences or as people, human beings, we want to other people. We want to go, well, he did it for this reason because this happened to him and that happened to him, so that's why he did it, and that would never happen to us, and so we're not those people. It somehow makes us feel safe in that sense. The question of how you combined these two different people was always at the front of my mind until I met Amy. And she really described that this thing happened where his eyes drifted off and this extraordinarily arrogant persona came over him, and just she defined it as a disassociative. It was two different people. And that suddenly relieved me of a lot and made me go, I'm just going to go and read everything I can about this man, try and embed all of that, let Tobias hunt for the moments of when things are revealed. And Tobias is an amazing director, not only in giving notes to actors, but allowing space for us to find things in the silence. But then to invest in that moment when that other character arrives and really invest in that being a different person.
And Tobias, he mentions that, you know, the why, where like a lot of other films that we've seen focus on that. It's like, why is he doing this? You turn the focus instead of why he did this, but to the system that is like enabling this serial killer. Can you tell us about switching the focus as well?
It became very clear reading Charles Graeber's book, The Good Nurse, that the real serial killer here was the American hospital system. He could have been stopped, and he wasn't. And that's a big tragedy. And I understand our fascination with darkness, because the darkness is part of us, and we need to understand it. And we are obsessed with darkness these years. There's a whole wave of what is called true crime, which, you know, in news media is like breaking news. It's like a label you put on to get somebody to click on it and be fascinated by it and go for it. But it's pretty empty. There's nothing there. It's just darkness. And what Amy brought, and in truth about the system, was a reason to tell this story, a reminder of the responsibility we have as individuals in these systems. And in that way, it didn't really matter why Charlie did it. It mattered why the system didn't stop him. And that question is the most important question to ask here. So that's what we focused on.
Yeah, cinematically, the first half of the film is so dark. You know, we're in this hospital rooms, and the lighting, you know, low-key lighting. Can you tell us about that choice? And
well,
it was a good choice.
I want to say, if you thought it was dark on screen, you should have seen what it was like in reality. I turned up for our first day of filming, and it was the shot when he walks down the corridor at the beginning, pitch black. Could not see a thing. And I was like, and I looked on the monitors, and it was much lighter, but because they opened the apertures in order that it had this sort of grainy effect. But it was so dark what we were filming that it created this silence and this poise that everyone on the crew had. It was absolutely magnetic.
Yeah, but probably from you were not seeing the crew, so it must
amazing.
have been liberating.
Hugely, hugely liberating.
But cinema is once in a while slaves to wanting to entertain, and plot becomes demanding. So instead of just being ready for life to unfold, you're waiting for plot to begin. And life is not like that, you know. I'm not waiting around to fall in love with somebody. I'm doing something else, and then I fall in love with somebody. And it's always at a point when it's a real problem in my life that happens. And then a new story can unfold. In this case, I didn't want to light the set so that we were ready for all these killings. and so that we knew exactly what was going to happen. We just needed to be invited inside. So what we did was we created frames that would be, like a window into an already established reality, and then we would invite the audience to stand there and look through that window, and not add more or less, just look through this window and know that something will happen. It will be a little boring, but wait, it will also be scary. And so the darkness helped us because people started to search in those frames. It's like, what's going on there? We can't even see Eddie's eyes. And of course, some producers would give us notes like, could you just lift it just a bit for us to at least see something? Wait, we have Eddie Redmayne. He's great. We'll be able to read him when we need to read him. We'll be fine. So the darkness was never a battle, but it was definitely intentional to have us all engaged in, mesmerized by what's going on here. Why can't we see anything yet?
Yeah. And Eddie, I think you've addressed it. What was it like from your vantage point to be in this environment?
Honestly, I think you said, it was incredibly liberating. Like, there is a thing, as many of you guys who sort of work in the industry will know, that fundamentally, when there is a camera here, if we're filming it, having a conversation, one acknowledges that there is a group of people just here, or whether you're on stage, and part of the key doing my job, which is still learning, is to block that out, and to feel completely at ease, despite the fact that you're being watched, whether it's by a theatrical audience or by a team of camera crew and people. And not only did Tobias use long lenses, like that first shot of the film, when it pushes in, I mean, that camera was 15 meters away, and I didn't even know what was being caught and observed. And that, for actors, is the closest to a reality you could find. But for a lot of the film, when it was in this darkness, Jessica and I had such an intimacy, and it felt so, it just felt so real. And that's something that Tobias has done in all of his work. But for example, lots of the background artists in this were medical professionals. He wanted to create an environment having patients and doctors in all of the rooms, so that wherever his camera went, that it would be caught. And that gave a kind of truth to Jess and I that we could also then utilize. So between takes, you could be talking to a nurse and say, how would this, and they would give you an idea that would spin something that became spontaneous.
Tobias, the climax of the movie to me was the scene in the diner where Jess and Eddie are in front of each other. Can you tell us about staging? It's one of the most suspenseful scenes and so scary. Tell us about staging that scene.
I've always been fascinated with diners. And it's basically because we don't have diners in Denmark. It's not a thing. So these booths where you're like on couches in front of each other, in your own little universe, separated from other people, is like very exotic to me.
And yet exposed, because you have windows and
Right.
everybody's walking by.
And then watching David Fincher's work, I mean, he's the master of diner scenes. We've seen the best diner scenes in his work, and I still believe that the best diner scene around is from Seven, when she tells that she's pregnant, and Morgan Freeman talks about have lost a child at one point. And the reason that works is that it's two people that there are rules in a diner, like there are other people. So it's a scandal when Eddie suddenly hits a fork. It's very important. It happened in a diner in real life, but we could have, hid them away in a corner. But we had to put them out there where it was dangerous for them to have the conversation. And it was harder for him to keep his secret, but more necessary. So it needed to be a more aggressive reaction, fast, done, and then move on, because other people could be watching. So we went around and looked for diners in Stamford, Connecticut, where we shot, and then we came into this diner. And if you've just seen it, but if you rewatch at a point, then just skip everything until the diner scene, and then I'll watch it all the way through. But the lamps over the tables are this blue glass with a black frame, and they look completely like the dining table lamp in Jane Fonda's apartment from Clute. So when I walked into that diner, and it was actually not really good to shoot in because it was narrow and we couldn't really place the camera anywhere, but the lamps were there. So I turned around and I said to the producer, it's the lamps from Clute. We need to shoot here. And he was like, fine, we shoot here. So the space was given. The only thing we changed was I made the menu cards bigger, so it would be a problem to turn them around and hit them over, just to have some obstacles for them to fight with as they were hiding the truths about their missions. They would have another obstacle with, this way too big menu card with way too many choices, as I remember all the diners I've been to. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, of course. Hey, amazing. Eddie, when he's caught and you have the scene with the police interviewing you, where you finally fess up, there is a big release. Can you tell us from an actor's point of view, the fact that you've been wearing this mask and all of a sudden it starts falling off the facade that he's been building? It's an incredible scene, acting-wise.
Thank you. I mean, the truth is that both the diner scene and the scene in the interrogation room, Christy Wilson-Cairns, our wonderful writer, those were recorded, and a lot of the words in that and was verbatim. So I had footage of Charlie in that scene, which was interesting. I mean, obviously she conflated it, and but what was interesting to me, there was a moment after this film when Charlie was in court, and the victims' families were there, and the judge was reading out a predicament, and Charlie started shouting at the judge about the judge's ineptitude, and he repeated this mantra over and over again, screaming it at the judge. He ended up being bound and gagged in court. And that person that I read about marrying with this other person who I'd seen, who was gentle and fragile, and everything that Amy had said, was finding the connection of those two was really interesting. Tobias had done this wonderful thing of not really introducing me to Namdi and Noah, who played the detectives during the filming. We shot that day in a tiny little room, and Tobias did this thing of, we talked a bit about the scene, but what he hadn't told me was that I was going to have my hand attached to the desk. And it was so interesting because the arrogance that Charlie has, which is an extraordinary feature of his personality, when we were in that room, even though he's been caught and he's totally lacks power, for me, the intention in that scene was to retain power against all the odds, even though they had all of the power. So my whole thing was like, I'm just going to win. I'm going to beat these people, even though I know. And we started doing the first scene with Noah, the first take of it, and these were long 15-minute takes. And we started doing the scene, and I was just trying to think, how can I win? How can I throw him off his go? And this thing happened where my hand just sort of made a noise and a chink of the handcuff, and I was like, ooh, interesting. And so gradually throughout the scene, I would just start syncopating this rhythm whenever the detective was getting too sort of confident. And it was from there that I knew I had to get to this place with the I can'ts. And we had also spoken about Francis Bacon and his paintings and this kind of this visceral raw. And so weirdly, the use of the handcuff was the key into it. But also Noah is so brilliant that there was just this moment where he just screamed at me. And it was terrifying. And it's the moment in the thing. And for me, it's one of my favorite moments of the film, because I love that you don't get Charlie's biography in this movie, but in that moment, I saw the 7-year-old child that was abused, and this kid, and it was an extraordinary day's work, that actually working with those brilliant actors and getting to really mine that scene.
Your Charlie uses he is bound. He's got empathy coming out of his ears. I mean, people are sympathetic to him, and then he uses that empathy that he builds against people. Were you aware of that superpower that Charlie had to lure people and bring him to their side.
I mean, absolutely. That was one of the keys into the film for me, was this idea that this man, empathy was his thing, and yet he then weaponized it, right? And how horrifying that is. But in the same way, that the way that he was combated was by this woman who was extraordinarily compassionate and just reminded him of his humanity, and that the way that these violent acts were stopped was through heart and through compassion. Mm-hmm. Certainly, that empathy was, I mean, there are many reasons he was allowed to go from 9 different hospitals. Obviously, one was liability, and these hospitals just wanting to move him on. That was the major thing. But also, there was a massive nurse shortage. Nurses are underpaid and underappreciated, and particularly night nurses. Charlie was fucking brilliant. He would turn up like any time of day. He would be the nurse that people wanted to take over his from, because he was quick. You know, normally it takes an hour to change over, nurse to update the new nurse with all the information. He could do it in 15 minutes. He would be fastidious and sort of brilliant. And that was one reason he was able to get away with it, because of how desperate people were for nurses and how good he was. And the other thing was that he was seen as gentle. Like, you know, he was that empathy was there, and the real Amy really said that was real. You know, that wasn't an act. That really was real. It was just there was this other person there.
Yeah. And Tobias, Jessica is not here, but she's brilliant in the film. Tell us about working with casting her and working with Jessica.
Well, Zero Dark 30 was the first film I ever saw where I bought the 3 p.m. show, and then I went straight in and saw 5:30. I was mesmerized and felt completely in love with the whole film and her performance, and I was in shock to see an actress that I didn't really know at the time, who was like Meryl Streep good. Like, I just sat there and I saw something I hadn't seen for years. Somebody who was able to communicate humanity and still being so cool and so silent in everything she did in Zero Dark 30. So when we started to work on this, she was like my obvious first choice. And we tried to, I tried to get her to read, and she was shooting, and there was many things going on, and at a point I was afraid that it wouldn't happen. So we started to look other places, and it just never felt the same. And then suddenly, one day I got a phone call that she was, ready to do a Zoom. And just meeting her there and talking to her about the film made it even more attractive to get it started. And then we started to talk about, so who should Charlie be? And we had different conversations. And I would, the producer, Scott Franklin, would say, he had just seen Theory of Everything, rewatched it with his son. And he was, what about Eddie Redmayne? And it just felt perfect. It was like immediately I knew that was a great idea. So I asked Jessica, because, she was going to be the lead in this. So what do you think about Eddie? And she was like, yes, let's do this as fast as possible. So I flew to London a couple of weeks later, and we met and had a couple of drinks. And over those drinks, we decided to do this film, the three of us. To work with Jessica was just, she's, as you know, hardworking, but she's so precise in everything she does. And she's very different from Eddie. They're like two very different, they have the same, in some way, process in understanding, but the approach to the work is very different. Eddie comes to set every morning with 1,000 questions, but he doesn't really need the answer. He just needs the space to, ask the questions and then find his way in. And
this is like a therapy session.
But brilliantly, and he finds his way in. So what do I care? That's all good. Jessica comes with one question. And it's a really fucking important question. Pardon my French.
Supposed to Eddie's questions?
Yeah.
Eddie's
Mine are
more a little
like,
at the end, I was like, I didn't really even hear the question. I just heard him ask himself a lot of stuff to get ready.
It's like, stop wittering, Redmayne. Stop.
No, I never said that, because clearly whenever we said action, you were there on point. So that was what you needed to do. Jessica just needed to come and throw a bomb, like with one big question that would destroy the whole day if you didn't have the answer. So in that way, I was happy that they were so different. Jessica was amazing, and the three of us found a very nice way to allow the scenes to be open and that it was okay to disagree about what the scene was supposed to be. I allowed Jessica to have her version, you had your version, and I had mine, and then we went to work. And then we found the truth in that. It's not a democracy, it's a piece of work that needs to be done, and everybody can come with their own truth and add that. And Jessica loyally, in almost every scene in this film she is, and she's driving the whole train, and she does it with like so effortless. Like she just looks like she's enjoying it and relaxing, and she brings so much to the table. I remember one thing from having her and Eddie surrounded with real medical professionals on set. There's one scene that you just saw where in the screenplay it's Amy enters Holly's room. Holly's in a coma. She turns her around, fluffs her pillow, and leaves. And it was just like a transport scene that wanted us to show like a daily routine for an ICU nurse. And then I didn't even mic Jessica for the scene because I just wanted to, 2 settings and then move on. And then Jessica came in and then she said, "Hey, Holly, it's Amy. I'm just going to turn you around." And she started to talk to Holly. And suddenly, not only did Jessica's Amy turn human, Holly was human. And then suddenly she was like, "I talked to your sister the other day. Oh, she has twins. I have no idea how she does that." Suddenly, Holly had a sister and twins, and there was a whole life happening in the room with this patient in a coma. And the humanization of the patient and the system and herself by catching that from some of the nurses around was brilliant and a great example of how Jessica adds to the scene every time she's there.
That's great. But Eddie, I hope you learned your lesson. Don't come with 20
Thousands
questions. Ask one question.
Oh,
and
boom.
And boom. There you go.
10,000 next time. It's all
Can
good.
I just say something about Jess, who was one of the great people, but also what she did on this film, the physical element of what she did on this film. So because of the heart disease, she would run around this set. We had this ward that had been built, and she would be running and running to get her heartbeat up, to get like a clammy face to play. And the camera would be rolling, and Tobias would be about to call action, and she'd come running in, and they'd be like, "There's a problem with the lens." And she'd be like off again on like a mini marathon, And so physically, it was so boring. But she also had this genius idea, and this is a testament to kind of, I suppose, ingenuity as an actor, and which is also to do with her playfulness, is she said she had an earwig put in her ear, which, by the way, I didn't know anything about this until we started promoting the movie, and which she had a heartbeat playing in her ear, and she gave Tobias the control of that heartbeat and could speed it up and slow it down depending on, and so she'd be playing these scenes, and then suddenly there'd be this other obstacle in her ear, and I just thought it was such a wise thing, and it's just an example of her brilliance. But she was so playful and also just a joyful. She's promoting a new television series called George and Tammy, hence she can't be here, but she has like a sort of a joyful optimism to her work. Tobias and I, throughout the process, kept going, this is, we're enjoying this too much. It's going to be a disastrous movie. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a disaster. And Jess would be like, "Don't be ridiculous. It's great. We're having a wonderful time. It's going to be." So she's a joy to work with.
Well, speaking of joy, incredible joy to have the two of you tonight. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely.